This is an extraordinary moment in China, and it's spreading further and wider. In cities right across the country, hundreds are taking to the streets, angry and fed up with the government's zero-COVID policy.
Fresh protests have broken out in major cities, with hundreds rallying at Beijing's elite Tsinghua University, chanting, "We want freedom."
Can a new Tiananmen Square happen in the 21st century? It's a question that's been on many people's minds since the beginning of 2022, when thousands of protesters took to the streets of Beijing and other major cities across China. They demanded that President Xi Jinping step down due to his authoritarian rule and failure to properly address pressing issues such as economic inequality, environmental degradation, and human rights abuses. In an unprecedented move, Chinese citizens risked their safety to speak out against a leader who has maintained an iron grip on power for nearly 2 decades. But will they be heard? In this video, we'll help you understand why Chinese protesters are demanding Xi Jinping step down and how the current situation is leading to Tiananmen Square 2.0. The factors leading to massive protests happening all over China and steps taken by the government to overcome the current ongoing crisis. So sit back, relax, and watch the video till the end to have a better understanding. The 1989 Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing, China were a series of peaceful demonstrations led by students and workers in the country's capital. The protests began in April of that year and lasted for several weeks, culminating in a violent military crackdown on June 4th. The protests began in response to a wide range of grievances, including calls for greater democracy, freedom of speech, and economic reform. The Chinese government responded to the protests with a heavy-handed military intervention, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of people and the imprisonment of thousands more. The events of 1989 remain a powerful symbol of the struggle for freedom and democracy in China, and the Tiananmen Square protests remain a defining moment in the history of the country. It's been over 30 years since the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, but the Chinese people are still fighting for their rights. On April 4th, 2022, protesters in Hong Kong and other parts of China took to the streets to demand that Chinese President Xi Jinping step down. The protesters are also calling for an end to China's zero-COVID policy, which they say is responsible for not only a recent surge in coronavirus cases, but also for the sudden rise of poverty. The new wave of protests represents a significant challenge to Xi Jinping's rule and could have far-reaching implications for the future of China. The protests happening in China are a direct result of the zero-COVID policy that's been put into place by the Chinese government. The zero-COVID policy is a set of policies implemented by the Chinese government in an attempt to eradicate the novel coronavirus from the country. These policies have been controversial and have been blamed for causing economic hardship and social unrest. This policy has caused immense hardship for the citizens of China, who are now living in fear of contracting the virus. The zero-COVID policy has also led to a shortage of essential goods and services, which has further exacerbated the situation. The policies of zero-COVID policy are to test all citizens of China for the virus, to isolate those who are infected, and to trace and quarantine those who have been in contact with infected individuals. In lockdown zones, shops and schools are closed. All stores must also close, with the exception of those that sell food. Some state municipalities have even gone to great measures, such as forcing workers to spend the night in factories in order to keep working while confined. The policy has been somehow successful in containing the spread of the virus, but has been criticized for its strictness and for the way it's been implemented. The price of food and other essential items has skyrocketed, and many people are struggling to make ends meet. The policy has also led to a decrease in freedom and an increase in surveillance. The policy has had a negative impact on the economy, and many businesses have been forced to close their doors. The strategy has drawn criticism since it's led to widespread screening and isolation of people even when they show no symptoms of the infection. People feel like they're being treated like criminals, which has resulted in countless protests. In recent weeks, there have been reports of protests breaking out in 13 different cities across China as people vent their frustration at the government's handling of the crisis. The most notable protest took place in the city of Wuhan, where the virus originated. Thousands of people took to the streets, chanting slogans such as "We want freedom" and "Release our relatives." The police responded to the protesters harshly, throwing water cannons and tear gas at them to scatter them. These protests are a sign that the Chinese people are growing increasingly frustrated with their government's handling of the pandemic. Residents of Lanzhou, a city in northwest China, have accused the government of being at fault for the recent loss of a kid during such a COVID lockdown. On November 1st, 2022, a 3-year-old kid was found unconscious, and his father was unable to seek immediate care for him in the Qilihe district of Gansu province. Residents were outraged by the case and came out to express their disgust. The boy's passing on Tuesday provoked uproar on social networks and is the most recent incident to fuel criticism of China's stringent zero-COVID policy. The boy's father, Tuo Shilei, told Reuters over the phone from the city of Lanzhou, which has been on lockdown for several weeks, "I personally think that he was indirectly killed." Protesters are calling for the resignation of Chinese President Xi Jinping and the end of Communist Party rule. They also desire more democracy and freedom. As of yet, the protests have been met with heavy repression by the Chinese government. Thousands more have been detained and many more have been under watch. Censors and demonstrators have been engaged in a cat-and-mouse game lately over complaints regarding the zero-COVID policy and other aspects of everyday life in China. The 96-year-old Jiang's passing, which was announced on Wednesday, provided one opportunity for some to quietly attack Xi. Moreover, after a fire in an apartment building claimed the lives of 10 people, videos uploaded on social networks in China appeared to depict new protests over COVID regulations. People may be seen in Urumqi assaulting police, crashing through a fence, and yelling, "End the COVID lockdown." But before we move on, if you're not subscribed to BizStudied, now is the time to do so. We regularly upload interesting and engaging videos, so be sure to hit that bell notification as well so you don't miss a single one of them. Back to the video. Despite a tight zero-COVID policy, infections in China have risen to unprecedented highs. Officials in Urumqi have now pledged to gradually remove the restrictions, though they dispute that they prevented anyone from fleeing the fire on Thursday. Since early August, there have been restrictions in place throughout the city, which serves as the regional capital of western Xinjiang. After the tragedy, a resident informed the BBC that residents of the burned-out enclave had been mostly banned from leaving their apartments. Chinese state media has refuted that. Authorities in Urumqi did, however, issue an extraordinary apology late on Friday, promising to penalize anyone who disobeyed orders. Residents were seen congregating on city streets after dark in footage that was released, many of them wearing masks. They were observed singing, fist-pumping, and yelling at the authorities. The Reuters news service confirmed the location. Rarely, demonstrators have stormed official buildings and set automobiles on fire. Wanting freedom has become the rallying cry for a wave of demonstrations that have swept the nation, largely being led by today's young, a majority of whom are too naive to have participated in earlier acts of direct defiance of the state. On Wulumuki Road in Shanghai, which bears Urumqi's name and was the scene of the protest the day before, police maintained a noticeable presence the next day. "We just want our basic human rights. We can't leave our homes without getting a test. It was the accident in Xinjiang that pushed people too far," said a 26-year-old demonstrator in Shanghai who wished to remain anonymous. People in Shanghai chanted on Saturday, "No PCR tests, we want freedom," followed by rounds of repeated calls for freedom, freedom. Moreover, a BBC reporter was beaten and assaulted by police before being taken into custody in Shanghai late on Sunday. This past weekend, anger over their deaths and growing irritation over the COVID-19 constraints that continue to be imposed on China culminated in massive rallies in dozens of the country's largest cities, constituting an unusual display of discontent against the ruling Communist Party. Besides Beijing, the nation's capital and the center of Chinese political power, was even damaged by protests. Despite significant police activity throughout the city, numerous demonstrations in Beijing occurred, with participants calling for democratic reforms, the rule of law, and an end to the nation's coronavirus controls. According to a list posted to the internet and dozens of demonstration recordings posted on social media, protests this past weekend reportedly expanded to even more than 50 Chinese university campuses. Students gathered at the prestigious Tsinghua University in the center of the Chinese capital, chanting, "We need democracy, rule of law, and freedom of expression." In reference to the events in Tiananmen Square, an experienced Chinese journalist said, "We haven't seen spectacles like this since 1989. This weekend, thousands of students gathered across the country, from Sichuan University in the west to Nanjing Communications University in the east. A national-level protest over the same issue, carried out in blatant defiance of a central government policy, is now unparalleled in China, where local protests over concerns like environmental pollution and land grabs are regular. On Saturday, December 3rd, China verified 4,231 additional cases of COVID, bringing the total number of cases since the pandemic began to 1.7 million. Although there have been reports of new infections all over the nation, the hardest affected regions have been Guangzhou in the south, Shanghai in the east, and Chongqing in the southwest. With GDP growth reaching its lowest point in decades, the tight measures have caused a severe slowdown in economic activity. This means that China's GDP increased by a measly 3.9% over the previous year, which is less than its target of 5.5% for 2022. More than a fifth of China's gross domestic product has recently been under lockdown as a result of the country witnessing record numbers of COVID-19 cases. Factories and ports have been forced to shut down for long periods of time due to lockdowns. They've also had an effect on communications with foreign companies. Additionally, China's lockdown measures are having an effect on the rest of the world, whose firms and consumers have come to depend on China for supplies of commodities. Closure at the Foxconn plant in Jiangsu hindered the production of iPhones, prompting worries about a future global shortage. Security has been boosted across cities in a nation where authorities have significant surveillance and security capabilities, even if protests in some areas of China appear to have mainly ended peacefully over the weekend. The authorities have deployed water cannons, tear gas, and riot police to disperse the protesters. Several protest organizers have also been arrested. In conclusion, the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 were a watershed moment for China. The country has been through a lot since then, but the underlying issues that led to the protests, economic inequality, government corruption, and a lack of political freedoms, haven't gone away. If anything, they've gotten worse. These demonstrations show the level of popular discontent and offer critical info on how governments should handle similar crises in the future. Governments are required to make sure that the populace is properly informed and that their issues are resolved quickly. China is at a critical turning point, and the road ahead may be long and challenging. What lies down this path is yet to be discovered. The current protests are a sign that the people of China are no longer willing to tolerate the status quo. They're demanding an end to one-party rule and the establishment of a democratic government. It is unclear whether or not the protesters will be successful in achieving their goals, but one thing is certain: China will never be the same again. That was all for today, folks. Hope this video was worth your time. What do you think? Will China be able to come out of such tumult? What steps should the government take to prevent China from falling? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.